Morning, Bible Geeks. Ryan Schumacher here, and we are talking about the final judgment once again. This is the second video in the series on the final judgment. Had to think about that for a moment. It's early, please forgive me. But today, we're talking in this video about the day of the Lord. This is a phrase that's used throughout the Bible to refer to the day of God's judgment. And I want to really hone in on what this language is talking about. Because as we saw in the first video, the images of the day of the Lord are pretty grim. This is like apocalypse stuff. This is you've got fire and brimstone falling from the sky, devastating everything. And this is imagery used in the Old Testament, and then it's used again in the Synoptic Gospels by Jesus towards the end. And so I really want to unpack what this is, because we're trying to sort out the difference between what the final judgment is and what the final judgment isn't. And the concept of the day of the Lord is very important. I think it's often misunderstood, and I'm going to hopefully take you through that argument here. So we're going to start by looking at the judgment discourse that's found in the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. I don't know if scholars formally call it the judgment discourse. That's what I'm going to call it. We're going to use Matthew's gospel just because I like it. But any one of these three would be fine. So the prompt begins here. Actually, I'm going to back up a second. We're going to pull over our handy dandy Logos. We're going to try and get the window to size right. Okay. So I want to start here. Let's look at, all right, so leading into this, Matthew 23, Jesus denounces the scribes and Pharisees. This is what's leading into what we're about to read. What comes immediately before the day of the Lord language comes in? Jesus is denouncing the scribes and Pharisees. So we have Jesus saying to the crowds and the disciples, and then we have, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, blind guides. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You blind guides. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You hypocrites. Okay. So this is the, more woe. Perhaps the strongest judgment language that Jesus uses in the Bible. Oftentimes you have people come before him who the Bible describes as guilty of this, that, or the other, pretty bad sin, and in often cases ongoing. Whether it's the prostitute, whether it's Zacchaeus, the tax collector, for heaven's sake, who's probably been shaking people down for years. He's able to, he forgives them. Like those stories are stories of redemption. Here the scribes and Pharisees get woe oracles just read way over top of them. And then he finishes it off with a declaration against Jerusalem. So, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For you will not see me again until they say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay. This is what now leads us into what happens next in Matthew 24. So, Jesus came out of the temple. His disciples pointed out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, you see all these, do you not? I tell you truly, or truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Okay, so this is what starts it. Jesus says the temple is going to be destroyed. His disciples then say, so when will this be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? I think that's exactly what it says, right? Yes, tell us when this will be and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age. All right, so that's our prompt. So what does Jesus then say? Well, first, so and I'm compressing here to get to the part that we want to get to, but people will be led astray by false messiahs, war, famine, and earthquakes. This is called the tribulation. The birth pangs of what will come, the apostles will be tortured and hated, and yet those who endure will be proclaimed as good news to the world. and then the end will come. This is in the next 10 verses or so. And then it goes on, so that's like this section here. So good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the world, then the end will come. And then what happens? So when you see the desolating sacrilege stated in the holy place that was spoken by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee the mountains. So, we're calling the language where there's a statue of Zeus put in the second temple in 168 BC. Basically saying that when you see something like that happening again, you should flee to the mountains. This is perhaps a little bit different than people would expect, because at that point in time, if there's going to be any sort of conflict, the place that you'd want to be is in a fortified city like Jerusalem. But he's telling them that they need to flee to the mountains. And then, when this all happens, there will be a conflict. Don't believe the claims that people will make about their own messiahship. So there will be many false messiahs. I'm still the Messiah. I'm telling you about this beforehand. He's almost staking his prophetic credibility on this, saying that there will be false messiahs. Don't listen to them. I'm foretelling all of this to you. When it starts to happen, remember that I told you this. All right, and then we get into the meat of the matter. So verses 29 through 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, tribulation is Jesus' word, not mine, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the celestial powers will be shaken. It's a quote from Isaiah 13 that we'll get to later. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with, power and great glory, which is Daniel 7. There was a video about that last week. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. All right. And then he says, all this will come to pass before this generation passes away. That's Matthew 34. 34, Bookmark that here. We're going to have to come back to that. But here we get, if you recall those images that we talked about before, with everything blowing up, the end over the world. This is the kind of passage that evokes that imagery. Between this one and a few others that we'll get to. So, actually, we're getting into them right now. So passages like Revelation chapter 8 as well that talk about the destruction of the parts of the earth, like hail comes down and a third of the rivers are destroyed by wormwood, and then fire and a third of this, that, or the other is destroyed. It makes it sound like truly the fire and brimstone falling down upon the world. And Jesus is using language that's sort of similar. It seems like the celestial bodies are dissolving away. So, as you might expect from me, at this point, by our 5th week, I'm going to tell us that we need to be careful when we're reading this kind of language. As we've described before, genres like apocalyptic need to be handled with care. We need to, when we're reading about things that are, fantastic like this, especially when there's a quotation from the Old Testament, we need to go back and see what context did that exist in. Jesus isn't quoting Isaiah 13 or the parallels that you find like Joel chapter 2 or Zephaniah or whatnot. This is not being quoted without his understanding that the audience will know what he's talking about. If somebody were to quote John 3:16 to you, the person doesn't need to say it's John 3:16. You understand that verse. You understand the context that it's in. You understand all of the implications that the person who's speaking it wants you to take forward with that. Likewise, when Jesus is quoting Isaiah 13 here, he fully expects his followers to understand the context that they had. This is a shared context. They are a high context audience. We are a low context audience. we need to understand what that context is. We need to do whatever we can to try and get ourselves into the mentality that they would have had to understand why and how Jesus is using that particular phrase. So I'm going to share Tom Wright's view on this because, after all, we're doing the series on Surprised by Hope. I'm going outside of the Surprised by Hope book here, though. I think that when he talks about judgment being good, like we talked about in the last video, he's standing on the shoulders of a lot of the scholarship that is published in his other books. So this is his view, at least as I understood it, from the New Testament and the people of God and Jesus and the victory of God. I would say many other scholars, and I'll even quote some of them as we get later, would assent to this view as well. And at the same time, there's others who would find no clearer passage in the New Testament of the coming destruction of everything than Matthew chapter 24. I invite you to look at this yourself. I personally find this compelling. I'm also going to, this is going to be dense. So fasten your seatbelts. You showed up to Bible Geeks. You're watching Bible Geeks. Therefore, you should expect it to be dense. But I was going to say this one even is going to be perhaps to more depth than we're used to having to go into. But patience will be rewarded if we can make it through. So I'm going to start with a quote from Tom Wright on Apocalyptic. I put this in one of our previous videos too, from the New Testament and the people of God, because I thought this was just so well spoken. I have often pointed out to students that to describe the fall of the Berlin Wall, as one well might, as an earth-shattering event, might perhaps lead some future historian, writing in the Martian Journal of Early European Studies, to hypothesize that an earthquake had caused the collapse of the wall, leading to both sides realizing that they could live together after all. A good many readings of apocalyptic literature in our own century operate on about that level of misunderstanding. Yup. When we're reading literature thousands of years removed outside of the culture that it was written in, it's hard work to understand what was actually being said. Events that are taking place in our time, heck, even on Twitter, seem to be represented entirely differently than what happened. It's hard work, and we shouldn't just read it and then say, well, whatever I think it means must be what it meant. We need to try to get behind, like I was saying before, what the writers meant, and then what Jesus would have meant to the people he spoke it to. So what is the day of the Lord? The day of the Lord, or as you'll find it in the Old Testament, the day of Yahweh, the Yom Yahweh, it's an important theme found in the Old Testament prophets. This is a phrase that I think it's only found in the prophetic literature or later. I don't recall this being discussed in the books of Moses. Okay, now I just want to know. I looked this up yesterday. Let's do this real quick. See if I can. So let's look for Day of the Lord. We're going to look for that phrase. And let's just look in our NRSV here. Yep. So you find it in the prophets. In fact, this is mainly even major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Then you have minor prophets: Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Zephaniah, Malachi. So the day of the Lord, there you go. So 28 results in 26 verses in the NRSV. It's translated a little bit differently. You're plus or minus 2 between the different translations. But this is a theme from the prophets. Oh my goodness. There we go. Sorry. Theme in the Old Testament prophets. A little over 24 times. In the quotations in the New Testament are used when Jesus is talking about the question of the temple and what's going to happen when the Son of Man returns. So, we were just looking right here. If you see the New Testament quotations, you don't actually see the day of the Lord word being used. So this is why, even though the specific phrase appears only a couple dozen times, it's alluded to more often than that because the passages are quoted. So we just saw one there in Matthew 24 that we'll go through the specific Isaiah 13 language right here. So the key passage, I would say, is we want to talk about Isaiah 13. So Isaiah 13 begins with a superscript, the oracle concerning Babylon that Isaiah son of Amoz saw. Now, just a quick side note, Babylon throughout the Bible plays many different roles. So in some cases, like in the exile, they are quite literally in exile in Babylon. Other times, like in the book of Revelation, Babylon is clearly being talked about symbolically. In some cases, Babylon could be like both, but it signifies wickedness. It signifies opposition to God, whether it's truly just acted as a symbol like that, or Babylon is in opposition to God's people, oppressing, keeping them in exile. But an oracle against Babylon, Babylon is set up as an enemy, a recurring villain, if you will, throughout the Bible. Now, this is the beginning of something in Isaiah where there's a bunch of different woe and judgment oracles. Babylon's not the only one that gets one of these. There's a woe to Babylon. There's one against Assyria and Philistia, Moab, Damascus. Interestingly enough, Israel, the northern kingdom, Egypt, Babylon again, recurring villain, Arabia, Duma, then even one against Jerusalem, southern kingdom of Judah, and then the kingdom of Tyre. So this whole section in Isaiah here talks about judgment, and it's prefaced by this generic section describing the day of the Lord. So what we're about to read regarding the day of the Lord is an overarching introductory narrative to all of these woe oracles. It's kind of even though it says it's about Babylon, which much of 13 is, if you were to look at, if we just pull Isaiah 13 up, this superscript right here, the oracle concerning Babylon, is before the quotation marks. And it's before the speaker, Isaiah, comes into the story. So somebody who's compiling this writes this. However, it's whether or not this part right here is specifically about Babylon, I think it could be well understood as being a preface to all of the judgment oracles that we're about to see. The reasoning does not hinge on this, though. All right, so Isaiah 13, 1 through 4. Yahweh of hosts musters an army. I love the NLT and what they've done with Yahweh Sabaoth, where I'm trying to see if I can find it here. Yeah, the Lord of hosts. You'll see that translated Lord Almighty in the NIV. NLT will go Lord of Heaven's armies. Perfect, spot on. That's the way to think about it. So the general of Heaven's army is mustering an army. And then in 13:5 and 6, they come from a distant land, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation, to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Okay, that's destructive. It's pretty bad. Then 13, 9 through 11, and then verse 13. See, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and humble the pride of the ruthless. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts. So here we see a couple things. First thing that we're seeing is that here's our celestial bodies here. The stars of heaven and their constellations won't show light. Sun will be darkened. No light from the moon. So it's this very climactic, very vivid scene of I mean, it kind of sounds like an eclipse in a way. There were some eclipses going on around the time of Isaiah. There's punishment, ending the arrogance of the haughty, humbling the pride of the ruthless. This also goes back to the expectation of judgment. What did the judgment of God mean to the Jewish people or the Israelite people? They're saying the day of the Lord is going to come here on Babylon in this section, and the wicked are going to be punished for their sins. And we think of that sort of, there is no one righteous, not even one, potentially hellfire for everybody. But in the context here, we're talking about national judgments of the nations that we just saw. There's going to be a humbling of the pride of the ruthless. So the expectation here is that God's judgment is going to be removing the evil and the oppression from the world. And that's why this can be well expected. This is something that people are looking forward to. So he will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts. So you have the heavens, that's God's abode. You have the earth, that's where humans are, and it's expected to shake. In Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, splendor and the pride of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. 13, I think that should say 13:19, not 13:9. It's just to be... Yes, that's right. In Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the splendor and the pride of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're wondering, by the way, why I quoted 9 through 11 and then 13, here's verse 12. I was just trying to make it fit on the slide. But I will make mortals more rare than fine gold, and humans than the gold of Ophir. I also don't know what the gold of Ophir is. So, but anyway, here, Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the splendor of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. And then it continues on. Okay, so that's ultimately at the end of the day of the Lord, Babylon will be like Sodom and Gomorrah. It will be flat and it will be smoldering ruin. And Babylon's king, Isaiah 14, 4. So, if we go to Isaiah 14, so you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. And then the particular relevant part I want to bring up is about the celestial bodies. That comes back. So, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the top of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. So, Babylon's king here now has self-described, or is at least described in the taunt, in a way makes it sound like he's self-describing, as essentially a deity. He's deified. I want to ascend to heaven, raise my throne above the stars of God. That's quite clearly the idea that the king of Babylon has been thinking of himself as a god. This is not at all surprising. We see this with other kings of Babylon later, like in the book of Daniel. This does not, by the way, mean Satan. That particular association comes from reading back when Jesus says to his disciples after they return, I saw Satan falling like a star from heaven. People then go back here and say, oh yeah, like the falling star in Isaiah. That must have been about Lucifer. No. This is not about Satan. This is about the king of Babylon. That doesn't mean that Jesus isn't talking about Satan in the New Testament. That means that Isaiah is talking about the king of Babylon. Now, one could say, here's where I could give some charity. One could say that analogously it works because Babylon is sort of the eternal recurring villain, and Satan is also a returning recurring villain. They all kind of go together. And if you want to typify it like that, I mean, it's not wrong, but this specifically historically had a meaning, and that meaning was about the king of Babylon. Okay, so we're going to pause here. culmination of the oracle is that Babylon will be destroyed. Sun, moon, and stars melting away is a description of what's going to happen when Babylon is destroyed. Clearly, King of Babylon is not a star. Or, as it were, the planet Venus. That's the day star, as it was described. Clearly, he is not literally trying to raise his throne 5 miles up so as to reach the firmament. Like, there was not an effort to try and get him built all the way up. There's one Tower of Babel, and it was not at this point in time. And clearly, he didn't fall Humpty Dumpty style from the clouds. This is symbolic language. That is a taunt. It is to be understood as figurative, and it's talking about the haughtiness and the pride of the king of Babylon. We need to understand that. That's how this language is being symbolically used throughout the prophetic oracle. We need to then read back and make sure that we're fully understanding the genre here, because if there's symbolic speech in the poetry here, and everybody can agree on that, then perhaps it's being used further back. So let's keep going with that. We're going to press on to more on the sun and moon and stars darkening to see if this is a fair thing for me to say perhaps we shouldn't be reading this flat literal. So celestial darkening, if we look at the occurrences of this in the Old Testament, Isaiah 13:10, we just read it. It's about Babylon. Babylon was sacked by the Assyrians. It was destroyed by Assyria. I'm going to refer to this passage a few times, so I might as well read it right now. Isaiah 10. Starting verse 5. So, Assyria, or NRSV, you're letting me down. Woe to you, Assyria, the rod of my anger. Yeah, hold on, we need to change the translation here. Let's do something. Here we go. Okay. So, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my wrath. Okay? Pause on that point. Assyria is the rod of God's anger. But this is a woe oracle to Assyria, even though if Assyria is the rod of God's anger, that means God is wielding the rod. Assyria is the rod, and he's speaking to the rod and saying, woe to you. The staff in their hands is my wrath. Woe to you who are doing the thing that I'm decreeing that you do. I will send him against a godless nation. That's actually, there were lots of those. We'll go on down more, though. I will command him to go against a people destined for my rage, to take spoils, to plunder, and to trample them down like clay in the streets. But this is not what he intends. The rod, Assyria, is not what he plans. His intent is to destroy and to cut off many nations. For he says, aren't all my commanders kings? Isn't Calno like Carchemish? Isn't Hamath like Arpad? Isn't Samaria like Damascus? As my hand seized the idolatrous kingdoms, whose idols exceeded those of Jerusalem and Samaria, as I did to Samaria and its idols, will I not also do to Jerusalem and its idols? So he's the king of Assyria is very haughty. So when the Lord finishes his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for his arrogant acts and the proud look in his eyes. So, pause here. Assyria, in this case, in this oracle of Isaiah 10, is coming against Mount Zion and Jerusalem. Judah, is being judged. And after that judgment, I will punish the king of Assyria for his arrogant acts and the proud look in his eyes. But here, so we can see a few things. Assyria still has culpability, but Assyria is being used by God as judgment against Mount Zion and Jerusalem. So, in this case as well, the Assyrians appeared to be the rod of God's anger against Babylon. It is also possible that this, because in Isaiah 13:17, told you this would be dense. Oops. Where it says, look, I'm stirring up the Medes against them, who cannot be bought off with silver, who have no desire for gold. This is in the middle of that Isaiah 13 oracle about the day of the Lord. So I'm stirring up the Medes against them, who cannot be bought off with silver or gold. Their bows will cut young men to pieces, have no compassion on the little ones. They will not look with pity on children. In Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when I overthrew them. So the Medes are being brought against Babylon, who's going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah. So another interpretation here, I actually find this one to be more compelling, is that this is an oracle about the coming desolation of Babylon by Cyrus, which is described in 13:17, and then further in Isaiah 40 through 48, Isaiah 45 in particular. So the judgment is coming against Babylon. In particular, I guess let's pause here for a little more than I planned on. Okay, because we have, look, the day of the Lord is coming. So this is day of the Lord imagery. The stars in the sky and the constellations won't give their light. The sun will be dark. The moon will not shine. I will bring disaster. And there's lots of repetition. I'm stirring up the Medes against them, and Babylon will be destroyed. These things are all held together. Day of the Lord, burning anger, celestial darkening, the Medes, and the destruction of Babylon. That, in other words, the means by which the destruction is coming, which is associated with the day of the Lord and the celestial darkening, is the kingdom being brought against Babylon. It's the Persians. All right? Hold that thought. Happens more than once. Because Amos then, we have the same language in Amos. The northern kingdom of Israel is given the same thing. It will come about in that day, this is Amos 8:9, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will make the earth dark in broad daylight. This is a judgment oracle being spoken against Israel, and then Samaria, the capital of Israel, fell to the Assyrians in 722. The judgment had been executed. A quick aside too, darkness in midday is described as a covenant curse for disobedience, as is your enemies ruling over you. So what's happening is that the covenant curses are coming against the northern kingdom of Israel. I'm trying to keep us out of having to go into every single one of these references. So hopefully you can take my word for it, and if not, go and look it up yourself. But the entire book of Amos is one extended prophecy of judgment against the northern kingdom. And here in Amos 8:9, so on that day, this is the declaration of Yahweh. Actually, I don't know if that says Yahweh, the Lord God. I will make the sun go down at noon, darken the land at daytime, turn your feasts into mourning. I will cause everyone to wear sackcloth. Hear this, the days are coming. I will send a famine through the land. This is all about what is going to happen to the northern kingdom. So the sun and moon darkening, the judgment that is coming, eventually they were judged. They were destroyed. Nothing was left. Samaria was conquered by the Assyrians. That was the judgment. In Ezekiel, we have this for the Egyptians. This is Ezekiel 29 through 32 talks about this, but at the end of 32, when I blot you out, this is to Egypt, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the shining lights of the heavens will darken above you and put darkness on your land, says the Lord God. And how will this happen? I will make many peoples appalled at you. Their kings shall shudder because of you. When I brandish my sword before them, they shall tremble every moment for their lives, each one of them, on the day of your downfall. So Yahweh's talking about brandishing his sword. For thus says the Lord God, the sword of the king of Babylon shall come against you. The sword of Yahweh is the sword of Babylon against Egypt. The sword of Yahweh is the Assyrians, the rod of his anger, against Judah. The sun and moon and stars darkening on the northern kingdom and the utter destruction of them is the fall of Samaria in 722. And in here, in this case in 609, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon defeats Pharaoh Necho II and the combined armies of Egypt and Assyria at Carchemish. Nebuchadnezzar's chronicle claims that the entire area was conquered and all the enemies were killed. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, the sword of the king of Babylon shall come against you. This is Yahweh's sword. This is talked about by Ezekiel. And in the context, like 2 verses prior, he's saying, I will blot you out, cover the heavens, make their stars dark. So we can see it right here. When I snuff you out, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. I will darken the shining lights in the heavens over you, bring darkness on the land. I will trouble the hearts, bring about your destruction. I will cause many nations to be appalled by you, and their kings shuddered with fear before you, or because of you. I will brandish my sword in front of them on the day of your downfall. For this is what the Lord God says, the sword of Babylon's king will come against you. All of this is the same discussion. This is how it works. That this, sun and moon and stars is figurative language for the coming desolation. It is not actually true. I mean, maybe there were eclipses every time, but it is not actually true that the cosmos came to an end when these judgments occurred. This is language of judgment. Yahweh says this, and then he brings up an army against them and destroys whomever it is that he's targeted. So whether it's the Assyrians, the rod of God's anger, or the Babylonians, God's sword, or the Persians, Cyrus who's being raised up, Isaiah 45, we see that the nations are brought up by God to execute judgment as he sees fit. And the key point is that when this is prophesied in the Bible, the day of the Lord language is used. The day of Yahweh is described in this way, along with the language of the darkening of the skies, blotting out of the sun and the moon and the stars, etc. So here's the chain, here's the connection. Day of the Lord, blotting out of sun, moon, and stars. Another nation brought up as God's punishment to cause desolation. This is socio-political military stuff that's being talked about in all of these examples. And I gave you the examples and how they took place in the Old Testament. This is much more immediate and relevant in the Old Testament. It is about, some of you may see where this is going now with Matthew 24. This is about a coming judgment, but the judgment is taking place through the nations because God is utterly sovereign over all of them. So I wanted to bring up this quote here too from Gary Smith to help maybe give some more contextualization. So Amos applies similar consequences of gloom and darkness to an intermediate historical day when God came in power to destroy the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, in 721. Indeed, when a nation and its cities are destroyed and burned, the lights go out for those people when the smoke from that burning city blocks out the sun. That day is the end of the world for them. So, let the reader understand that the sun and moon and stars being blotted out is part of the catastrophic language that's being used to describe what's going to happen when God's judgment through one of the nations comes upon whomever the woe is against. So I'm now pulling NT Wright in here for a moment. So we've already commented on the meaning of this is in the middle of an extended argument. So the quote, I'm plucking it here to make the point, but we've already commented on the meaning of the darkening of the sun, moon, and the stars. This is simply the way regular Jewish imagery is able to refer to major sociopolitical events and bring out their full significance. The part that I ellipsed out there basically said it is crass literalism to say that it's the end of space-time, because that's not the way it was actually used and actually played out in the Old Testament. These verses then are not flat and literal prose. They do not speak of the collapse or the end of the space-time universe. They are, as we've seen from the passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah quoted above, typical Jewish imagery for events within the present order that are felt and perceived as cosmic, or as we might. I misquoted that here. As we should, as. Oops. Sorry, I don't exactly know what belongs there, but perceived as cosmic or earth-shattering. So what do we have so far? If we pause for a moment, all this day of the Lord language, if we think of this as future eschatology, purely just what's happening in the future, what do we make the fact that many of the powers that are mentioned in Isaiah 13 to 24 don't even exist anymore? Exactly who are the Moabites fearing right now? Why are you going to airdrop Isaiah in the middle of the 8th century BC to rant about eschatology that won't be realized for thousands of years, mentioning powers that don't exist anymore? especially when so much of this other stuff is particular to that time, like Cyrus, for instance, like Babylon coming against Egypt. Strange credulity. There is immediate fulfillment. The day of the Lord is not just a future event. There have been many days of the Lord for these people. It's the day of Yahweh's victory. It's the day of Yahweh's judgment. And there have been many days of the Lord throughout history. There will be a final judgment. There will be a final day of the Lord. I'm not saying that's not true. What I am saying, though, is we need to understand what we'll know about the day of the Lord when we look at the way Jesus describes it. Okay. So Jesus' quotation then of the day of the Lord imagery in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21 is quoting this judgment oracle against Babylon. The biblical usage of this image seems to predict a coming military socio-political catastrophe, as is the case for Israel and Babylon and Egypt. Because of God's sovereignty over all the nations, these judgments that were brought by the rods of his anger, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they are instruments of the judgment of God coming upon them. So Jesus is using the imagery that was used to say that a nation is going to come up in judgment against you. That's the quote. That's what it means. That's what he's referring to. So let's recall then, what prompted Jesus' whole discourse on judgment in the first place? Jesus is saying the temple is going to be destroyed. Now I'll bet some of you are getting this more. And the disciples are saying, tell us what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age. Jesus answers by saying there will be tribulation, there will be the abomination unto desolation, an idol in the temple, judgment, sun, moon, and the stars, the Son of Man appearing. And all of this will come to pass before this generation passes away. It leads to strained exegesis if this generation just means thousands of years, if it's purely future-oriented. But I will bet if those of you who know your biblical history, you can figure out where this is going. In Matthew 23, Jesus pronounces the 7 woes in the scribes and Pharisees in the temple. In Matthew 24, he says the temple will be destroyed. When asked to explain himself, he quotes the Babylon judgment oracle. Just like Babylon, so too will the temple be judged. And then he quotes the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, where the Davidic Messiah is exalted over the beast, which represent the kingdoms. He assumes the throne over the whole world. As a side note, we clearly have Adam ruling over the animals there as well, because the Son of Man, the one like the human being, is exalted over the beast. But woe to the temple. It's a woe oracle. Temple will be destroyed, judged. The sun, moon, and the stars will darken. What's the woe against? The woe is against the temple. The woe is against Jerusalem. And so Jesus has equated the temple with Babylon, the symbol of the enemies of God, and he is saying that the temple is about to be judged. If you know your biblical history, you know what happened. The temple was destroyed. The Romans came in and destroyed it. It should be hardly surprising that Jesus equates the temple with the enemies of God, given the 7 woes that came up beforehand. He's entirely fed up with the temple and with the priests. The tribulation then that he talks about is the oppression and persecution in AD 67 through 69 that led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Therefore, this generation did not pass away until all these things took place. This part right here is entirely within the context of him answering the question about the destruction of the temple. The sun, moon, and stars darkening that you see in the Synoptic Gospels here is not the sun, moon, and the stars darkening of the final judgment. It is about the destruction of the temple. That's what he's talking about. Judgment took place against Jerusalem and the temple in the same way it took place for Babylon, Egypt, and Israel, by the rod of God, a foreign army, in this case Rome. And Jesus the prophet is thereby vindicated. The idea also, and this, I don't have enough time to get into this, but the identification of Jerusalem and the temple with Babylon brings Exodus imagery to Jesus' prophecy, complete with darkened skies and everything. With Babylon defeated, the promises to Jerusalem are now transferred to Jesus and his people. Meanwhile, Jerusalem herself has become the great enemy, the city whose destruction signals the liberation of the true people of God. This is Tom Wright in Jesus and the Victory of God. The end of exile is actually transferred to the destruction of the temple. If the temple is Babylon, then the ultimate exodus, the ultimate final return from exile, was the destruction of the temple. Because the temple had become corrupt. The covenant curses are executed. And contrary to all dispensationalism, there are no future promises for the ethnic Israel. The covenant curses were executed. They were Babylon. And the judgment came upon them. And this is Jesus imagery here. If you purely look at it from an eschatological standpoint, you miss this. You don't see what's actually being said there. So I'm pulling in a few people as support for this view to make sure that not only am I not just making it up, but there's more people aside from Tom Wright. So thus, when the significance of the Old Testament imagery is appreciated, verses 29 through 31 may be recognized as the context virtually demanded as a highly symbolic description of the theological significant coming destruction of the temple and its consequences. So this is R.T. France in his commentary on Matthew. Tom Wright, of course, one of the main reasons why the obvious way of reading the chapter has been ignored for so long must be the fact that in a good deal of Christian theology, the fall of Jerusalem has had no theological significance. These passages have been read as general warnings of hellfire and an afterlife, rather than the literal and physical divine judgment through Roman judgment we've seen to be characteristic of Jesus' story. Just as before, Jesus had used Tyre, Sidon, and Sodom and other pagan cities as the types of judgment that was to fall on this or that town when a village rejected him, so now, faced with Jerusalem and its rejection of his message, he chose that imagery that had been used to describe the greatest pagan city of the Old Testament period. The destruction coming on Yahweh's chosen city would be like that which fell on Babylon. They are being judged, and there is a new covenant that is going out into the world. And then finally, I thought, this was great. Nick Perrin, he's the president of Trinity International. He was a professor at Wheaton. Full disclosure, he was one of my New Testament professors. And you actually find him in the acknowledgments for Surprised by Hope. He was Tom Wright's research editor at the time. So that Jesus should identify the temple with wicked Babylon is shocking in its own right. But what better way to signify that the termination of the temple meant, at least for the Christ followers, the termination of the Babylonian exile? But if this is the case, I can almost hear some of my readers object, then the coming of the Son of Man has nothing to do with the parousia, but with the destruction of the temple. My response, exactly. So this whole thing is about the vindication of Jesus as the prophet and the judgment that's falling upon the temple, the judgment that's falling upon Jerusalem. So when we look at this language and we think that what it means is that everything's just going to dissolve away, that's not really what's going on here. This is a judgment oracle. The day of the Lord refers to the way in which Yahweh brings judgment to bear. This has taken place throughout history and is described using symbolic and apocalyptic elements. The day of the Lord should not be understood as referring to the annihilation of space-time, the cosmos, etc. Sort of the end over the world is just not what this is about. Nonetheless, there is a future day of the Lord that is yet to be realized. We see things further on where there will be a judgment, and I think we're going to get into that in the next video. Jesus continues in Matthew 25. He's not done talking, so we're going to see the way that Jesus describes what is ultimately going to happen. But the thing that we should not expect is that truly everything is going to melt away into utter destruction. That is not what the language is intended to mean. So I hope that I hope you were able to hang on. This is a long video. I don't really think there is a way for me to split it up well. But I hope this helps you understand the day of the Lord language better. So we're going to then get into what will happen at the final judgment as described in Matthew 25. And what happens in particular, we've talked about what happens to the righteous at the judgment, what happens to the wicked at the judgment. So thank you so much for watching Bible Geeks. If you stuck around for this one, you get your geek badge for today. I really appreciate it. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.